Thank you for joining us today. I'm Father Mark Francis, President of Catholic Theological Union. For over 20 years, CTU has offered the Sundays at CTU which highlights contemporary topics in the Catholic Church. Today's program, Indigenous People and the Church, is a panel presentation moderated by Sister Joanne Doy, Assistant Professor of Intercultural Studies and Ministry at CTU. And our panelists are Dr. Michelle Andros, former faculty member here at CTU, and now Dean of the Faculty of Theology at St. Paul University in Ottawa, Ontario, and Sister Priscilla Solomon, a member of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Sault Ste. Marie community in North Bay, Ontario, and a leader in Indigenous people's rights. Today's panelists will discuss some key issues between Indigenous peoples in the Americas and the Church, with a particular emphasis on reconciliation. A focus of the discussion will be on the challenges for the Church as it works towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. CTU proudly has a long-standing relationship with and emphasis in its programs of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. I'd like to extend a special thanks to you, Father Roger Schrader, and CTU's Department of Intercultural Studies for sponsoring today's event. At this time, I'll turn the program over to Sister Maria Simperman, Associate Professor of Catholic Theological Ethics and Director of the Center for the Study of the Consecrated Life at CTU, who will give a special introduction and invite Sister Priscilla to begin a short prayer service.
I too offer my welcome to all on this sunny Chicago afternoon here at CTU. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. And I begin with an acknowledgement of the land and the people. I learned this in Australia, where every civic and religious gathering begins with an acknowledgement of the Aboriginal peoples. I thank you, God, for the land upon which we stand, which was once the land upon which the Illinois, Miami, and Potawatomi people lived. I thank them for their care of the earth upon which I walk, and for their care for the waters of Lake Michigan, from which I drink. May we care for the earth as they did, seeing all of us interconnected as God's creation in our common home. Amen. It's an honor to introduce you to Sister Priscilla Solomon, an Ojibwe woman and a sister of St. Joseph of Sault Ste. Marie in Canada. She is one of 10 children of elders Eva and Art Solomon. Her sister, Sister Eva Solomon, also a CSJ, is a familiar face to us at CTU. She is an alumna. So welcome to you as well today, Sister Eva. I first heard Sister Priscilla speak at a spirituality forum, which my Ars Religious of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, Canada, US province sponsored in 2017. She spoke on all my relations, the circle of life, and opened my eyes, ears, and heart to ways of seeing and being in deeper relationship. Sister Priscilla works in the Faith and Justice Office in her congregation. She's a member of various committees and groups working on ecological justice, human trafficking, Indigenous rights, healing and reconciliation, the elimination of poverty, everything. She works on the parish, diocesan, country, and international levels. She was in Rome last year during the Synod on the Amazonia, which was convened by Pope Francis. And of course, she is deeply relational and a much sought after presenter. I had more time to engage and share and actually partner with Sister Priscilla in 2019 and 2020. She is on the committee of her congregation that's working on a process towards reconciliation with the First Nations peoples in Canada. And that flows out of their mission of unity and reconciliation. I had the privilege and joy of walking with them and learning and widening my own heart. The experience continues to be transformative. So I am grateful for Sister Priscilla's wisdom, which is her source of strength, gentleness, which is her way of honest engagement, and love, her way in which she deepens and widens, all to receive God's love. And so as a closing way to welcome her, I offer some words from another Ojibwe, Richard Wagamisi. And it was actually Priscilla and Eva who introduced me to him. And I think the woman in this is Sister Priscilla. Me, tell me about love. Woman, it is our only real choice, the only thing that we can truly give. Me, how do we do that? Woman, choose it above all else. Love is you leading me back to the highest possible version of myself. It's me leading you back to who you were created to be. It is the most important choice we can make for each other. Me, those closest to us, you mean? Woman, no, everyone, everything, widening our circle at every opportunity. Me, sounds hard. Woman, so is being born, but we all do it. These speak to me of what Sister Priscilla is about and leads us to, love. We welcome you, Sister Priscilla, to open our time together in prayer and ritual.
Great, thank you. Bojo, Indishnikas Ogimakwe, Makwa and Dorem. My spirit name is Ogimakwe, and my tribe, my clan is Makwa, my father's clan, which is our Ojibwe way of acknowledging our heritage. But I also always want to acknowledge my mother. My mother's clan is the Deer clan, and I am the fruit of my mother and my father's love. So I think that it's really important to acknowledge both parents, both clans. And I'd like to begin today sharing with you, I'd like to begin with the smudge and a prayer in the directions. And just a word about the smudge before I do that. It's a cleansing ritual among many Indigenous nations, definitely among our Anishinaabe nation. And in this nation, we use our sacred medicine plants. The one that I'm using is sage, which is a purification medicine. And we believe that as we light the medicine and let it burn and let the smoke rise, the smoke carries our prayer to the Creator. But at the same time, that smoke cleanses us. So we seek to cleanse our minds, we cleanse our eyes and our ears, that we might see and we might hear what is good and true. We cleanse our mouth, that we speak words of truth, and our heart, that we can let go of those negative feelings and the fear or the anxiety or the irritation or the resentment, anything that our heart holds that is a negative energy, that we can let go of that and simply be open and present to the world around us. And so as I begin this smudge, I invite you to open up your spirit by drawing the smoke toward yourself. I won't draw it in all the different ways that I identified simply because of time. but draw the smoke toward yourself, acknowledging that what is in me that gets in the way of being whole and free, loving and caring and trusting, all those good energies, whatever gets in the way, I want to let go of at this moment. I also want to acknowledge that North Bay and our mother house here is on the territory of the Nipissing First Nation, one of the Anishinaabe peoples in Ontario. And the Nipissing people who were here long before anyone else arrived. So we acknowledge their territory and their care of the land and the life of the land before anyone came. I invite us now to turn our attention to the direction of the east. And I will send the smoke in the direction of the east. And I give thanks, Creator God, Geshem. I give you thanks for the guardian spirits that you have sent to guard and protect the east. I give you thanks for the dawning of a new day, every day. I give you thanks for the new life that comes from the east. I give you thanks for all of the peoples of the east, and in particularly for the peoples of the symbolic yellow-skinned race, all those people whose ancestry is from the east. We give you thanks for them, and we ask you to bless them. I give you thanks for the generations that are coming toward us through the eastern doorway. And I give you thanks for the infants and the little children and ask that you bless and protect them. And I also thank you, Creator God, Geshem. I thank you for your son Jesus, who came through the eastern doorway. And during his life here with us, said to us, I am the light. May we follow his light. I invite you now to turn your attention to the south. And I give you thanks, Geshem, Creator God, for the guardian spirits whom you have sent to guard and protect the south. I give you thanks for the gift of new life that comes to us in the north from the south. As the sun moves northward again, it always brings with it new life, new growth, new energies. I give you thanks for the red-skinned people, the symbolic red-skinned race. And I ask you to bless all of them. I give you thanks for the children and those who are beginning their journey toward maturity, the youth. I ask you to bless them. And I pray for the women. I pray, Creator God, remembering that you said, as you walked the earth with us, Jesus, you said, I am the life. May we truly live your life. Miigwech. I invite us to turn our attention to the west. The west is the direction of the doorway into the spirit world. And as we turn toward the west, we give you thanks, Creator God, for the guardian spirits whom you have sent to guard and protect the west. Creator God, we give you thanks for the black-skinned race, the symbolic black peoples of the earth, wherever they are, and who in these times are struggling particularly to take their place in our world without the threat of racism We ask you to bless them and guide them. Creator God, we give you thanks for all of those leaders who have journeyed with us on the way through life. Western doorway is the direction of our leaders, and we ask you to bless them and guide them. Jesus, as we walk our lives from birth to death, you journey with us. And sometimes we get lost along the way. And so we remember that you have said to us, I am the way. Let us follow your way, Lord Jesus. Miigwech. And invite us now to turn our attention to the north. I want to light a bit more smudge here. As we turn our attention to the north, we give you thanks for the guardian spirits of the north. We give you thanks, Creator God, for the white-skinned race, symbolic white peoples of the earth. We give you thanks, and we ask you to bless them. We thank you for the cold blanket that covers the north, the blanket of snow that gives us a sense of integrity and purity and stillness. And so, Creator God, remembering this, remembering that that sense of wholeness comes from living truth, we ask that you who have said to us, I am the truth, you will guide us to live the truth. You will guide us to speak our truth. And we ask that we do that with your love. Miigwech, Creator God. And we turn our attention now to our Mother, the Earth. Our Mother Earth has provided us with life, with food, with shelter, with everything that we need to walk through this life. From the very beginning of our existence here, she has done that, and she continues to do it, despite our abuse, despite our neglect. We ask you, Creator God, to forgive us for the ways in which we have abused our Mother, the Earth, for the harm that we have done, for our blindness. We ask forgiveness for all of the ways in which we and others have destroyed our Mother, the Earth, and all of her life that was intended as gift. Creator God, for this we ask forgiveness, and we say Miigwech. Creator God, Kajamnado, our father, our grandfather, our mother, our grandmother, we give you thanks for the spirit world, for the sky world, for the stars that have guided us, for the sun and the moon, for all of the winged ones. We give you thanks for the spirits. Creator God, we especially thank you for your gift of life to all of us. We bless you, we thank you, and we praise you. Amen. Miigwech.
Thank you, Sister Priscilla, for really opening our circle. The last 2 mornings I've seen Orion's belt in the sky. Eyes have been so clear, and I just feel like it's such a hopeful sign during these times of global chaos, suffering, and uncertainty. So I'd like to welcome also each one of you present in today's time. May we welcome one another from near and far as we continue to imagine and create a circle of listening and presence to one another and to the earth and to our creatures and winged, the non-human, to all of our earth really be present today. So as our speakers share hope and sustenance for this long journey that we're on. So I'm reminded of from my time with the Aymara in the high Andes. They have a concept of apacheta, which is sort of a crossroads where it's a crossroads on a long journey. And at that point, you're able to unburden your weariness. You actually leave a little stone. And then, at these crossroads, you see these little piles of stone. You unburden your weariness, and then you actually receive new energies and support from all those that have gone before you. So yes, we share kinship with each other and our ancestors on this earth and our common home. And so I just want to reaffirm in many ways, CTU has had a long commitment with Indigenous peoples. And right now I'll be introducing Dr. Michelle Andros. A little bit of the flow will be a short film after the introduction, and then I'll invite Sister Priscilla to return again and share more widely about the Canadian context. And it'll, I think, evolve into somewhat of a conversation, and then Michelle will also kind of close the conversation. So we'll kind of go with the circular forum. But at this point, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Michelle Andros, originally from Lebanon. He lives in Montreal, Canada with his family. He's the one person I know that knows how to bilocate with ease. He came 20 years, to Chicago. He was part of our department, Intercultural Studies and Ministry. And it was really at one of our meetings, we wanted to sort of celebrate one of the fruits of this long commitment. When the book was published on the church and Indigenous peoples, and yet it goes it's not just the book is just sort of symbolic of a long sharing across the Americas that he has been involved in. Since the 1990s, he's been doing, as the description, theological research on the relation of the church with Indigenous peoples in different parts of the Americas, and actively participating in several pastoral initiatives and significant spaces such as the World Social Forum, Third World Theologians, also involved in Mideastern theologians. I particularly am most familiar with your work in Chiapas, Mexico, with El Pueblo Creyente en Teología India and Monsignor Tatik Samuel Ruiz. As Father Mark Francis said, now, he was a faculty member here at CTU, and now he is Dean of the School of Theology at St. Paul University in Ottawa, Canada. And so although we miss your presence here at CTU, we know and reaffirm the continuity of relationship and friendship in this commitment and hope that we share. And today we look forward to hearing more on the reflection in the Canadian context. So to give an overview of this church and Indigenous peoples, we want to show this short 5-minute film, and you'll see Dr. Andros in there, and then you'll see him in person later. So thank you, Letitia.
The idea of the book, The Church and Indigenous Peoples in the Americas, comes from participation in an event in San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas, Mexico in 2015. It's an annual event to commemorate the anniversary of the death of Bishop Samuel Ruiz, who was instrumental in rethinking the relationship of this local church and the indigenous peoples in the area. So from that march of the local indigenous people came the idea, which focuses on the questions of reconciliation and decolonization, came the idea, why not hold a bigger event that brings voices from across the American continent to talk about the topic and its importance and the current state of this discussion in the church. The following year in San Cristobal, we were a big group from Canada, Indigenous and non-Indigenous theologians and pastoral leaders, and we decided we will hold a conference and invite people to speak on this topic from different experiences in the Americas. At the institution where I teach, Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, and the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University joined efforts, both interested in the topic and in promoting this conversation in the church, joined efforts, and we organized the conference in November 2016. So we brought 5 groups from all the way from northern Canada to southern Chile to address this topic. It's not by any means a representation of all the debates that are ongoing. It's more like snapshots from different experiences where there is an actual praxis of reconciliation in between the churches and indigenous peoples. The picture on the cover speaks a lot. It's actually one of the important chapters in the book because it's a window on this question of reconciliation and decolonization between the church and, I mean, it's about the reconciliation with indigenous peoples and the role of the church. So we're looking at this through the experience of Chiapas because of the centrality of this place geographically, being one of the first dioceses in the Americas after the conquest, where Bartolomé de las Casas was its first bishop, and at the same time because of the important movements of resistance and the important action of the church in this regard. So the photo is from the march in 2016, and it's an expression of indigenous people marching, demanding decolonization, calling for reconciliation on their own terms. And in the picture you see the faces of women carrying the crosses with the names of martyrs from an important massacre, which is also symbolic of the violence that indigenous people have been experiencing in the continent. And in the back of the photo you see Pope Francis with the new push that he's now promoting in the church in terms of reconciliation with indigenous peoples. And in the front we only see a part of a photo of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is a major inspiration for indigenous people and these movements of resistance. The intention of the book is to promote the conversation for reconciliation in service of decolonization, how the churches can contribute in the processes of reconciliation across the continent and across the world. The churches still have an important role to play in this regard. The voice, the call for reconciliation is coming from the indigenous movements of resurgence, has been coming for a long time. And the churches are constantly called to respond at a deeper level. There are good intentions, but the response hasn't been as deep. It's a call for reconciliation primarily with Mother Earth, learning to reconcile with the earth, and this extends to reconciling amongst people. And that's a key message coming from the lived experience of indigenous peoples and articulated very clearly in indigenous theology. This will have a great impact on rethinking theologies of reconciliation in the church and contributing to reconciliation in the wounded world and in the multiple crises we are living.
Thank you. So I invite you, Sister Priscilla, to begin sharing with us.
Okay, thank you. I'd first like to speak of 3 recent events that can move us toward conversion and reconciliation and transformation, which is really the call of our church today in relation to Indigenous peoples. And then I'm going to speak about reconciliation in Canada. 5 years ago, in his encyclical Laudato Si, Pope Francis introduced ecological integrity into the language and the consciousness of the global church and society. And he made it clear that ecological justice and social justice are not separate. Both are essential for the survival of the planet. He reiterated the message of liberation theologians that the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth are one, and they require a unified response. Today, this is what he says, today, however, we have to realize that the true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. That's Article 49. His understanding of the interconnectedness and interdependence of everything is clear in what he calls integral theology, integral ecology. And he recognizes the ancestral wisdom of Indigenous peoples. He spoke of their uniquely and highly developed understandings of the earth and earth-human relationships, and their bonds of care and responsibility for both individual and community life. And that includes the earth community life. He acknowledged that it is essential for Indigenous people to be dialogue partners in their own territories, but also to help transform the relationships that objectify, the current relationships that objectify the earth and earth life. In Laudato Si, he presents a prophetic vision, and it found expression in the Synod on Amazonia. The Synod participants presented and studied the very harsh realities of the social and the ecological devastation in Amazonia and the needs of the Amazonian church. And they challenged the church to find new ways to respond. In their final document, the Synod presents some very clear steps in developing relationships of dialogue and movement toward a church with an Amazonian face. And then in Carita, Amazonia, what I think is his love letter to the Amazon, Pope Francis writes, he affirms the work of the Synod. He articulates 4 dreams for the church in Amazonia, and he speaks frequently about the needs and the contributions of Indigenous peoples in Amazonia, at the same time as he recognizes the multiplicity of cultures there. And again, I want to quote him, because what he says about enculturating the gospel message in the faith applies to every culture, and it applies beyond Amazonia. And he says of the church, she constantly reshapes her identity through listening and dialogue with the people, the realities, and the histories of the lands in which she finds herself. In this way, she is able to engage increasingly in a necessary process of enculturation that rejects nothing of the goodness that already exists in Amazonian cultures, but brings it to fulfillment in the light of the gospel. I think those 3 events, 2 of which are directed toward Amazonia, really speak to the reality that the church faces with Indigenous people throughout the world today, all Indigenous peoples. And in terms of reconciliation in Canada, in the book that Michelle just presented a video on, there are 3 Canadian speakers. There were 3 Canadian speakers at that conference. My sister, Sister Eva Solomon, who spoke about her own experience of working for enculturation and reconciliation with the church. Another chapter was by a deacon, McDougall. I can't think of his first name, but he spoke about the entire process of reconciliation that I'll make reference to some extent today, but you'll get a much deeper passage of explanation of that of that process in his article. And the third speaker was Archbishop Sylvan Lavoie, whom Eva has worked with for many, many years, and who has worked with Indigenous people for most of his life and has been very supportive of the process of reconciliation. So about reconciliation in Canada. Historically, the church has been involved with Indigenous people since the arrival of the Europeans. The Jesuits and the Oblates were among the first that came here, Jesuits particularly, in Eastern Canada. And the Oblates, as the Western Canada opened up, Oblates moved in there. The Grey Nuns were some of the early religious here in Canada who moved westward with in the development and worked with Indigenous peoples. They worked from the east coast to the west coast. And those Oblates and Jesuits established parishes and schools in many Indigenous communities. And that's where those sisters taught. And they worked in other areas as well with the Indigenous peoples. But the challenge then, it's very much the challenge that we face today. They were very much a part of their own culture, their own society, and the church mentality then. And the mentality then, pre-Vatican II, was anything that's not Christian is pagan, and it's not acceptable. So our people were told, you can't be Christian and Indigenous. You can't practice your spiritual traditions. Indigenous people saw great value in what the church was offering. It was good news to them. And many of them became Catholic. And some of those Catholics later left the practice of the Catholic faith. And others remained Catholic in that time when they were being told that everything traditional to them was pagan. They remained Catholic because they valued it, but they also practiced their ceremonies in secret. And it was a great struggle for many of them. There were already schools established by the churches. And in 1867, with the British North America Act, when Canada became a country, it established a policy of assimilation in relation to Indigenous peoples. And what they saw was the best place to accomplish assimilation was to start with the young. So start with the children. And they used the schools then as tools of assimilation. And the church schools became government-sponsored schools, many of them residential schools, for about 150 years. And that whole process of one culture not understanding another, one culture thinking of itself as superior over the other, that whole reality meant that the Indigenous peoples lost their sense of their value, their dignity, and did an awful lot of damage to Indigenous people throughout that time. So in about the 1980s, after many Indigenous people had begun to come back to a sense of their own dignity and had begun to reclaim some of those traditions, there were several court cases that were successfully launched against the schools. And then in the year 2005, the Assembly of First Nations, which is a political organization of Indigenous chiefs across Canada, from the elected chiefs, not the traditional chiefs, those elected chiefs, they launched a court case against the Canadian government for the abuses in all the residential schools and for the whole assimilation policy. The government didn't want to carry the financial burden alone, so it involved the churches and the religious organizations, the religious congregations, and the dioceses that had worked in relation to the residential schools. And this was not only against the Catholic Church, but they involved the United Church, the Anglican Church, all of the major Christian traditions that had run schools in Canada, residential schools on the reserves. And in 2006, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was reached. And there were some very specific outcomes to that. One of them was financial compensation awarded to former students, both individually and collectively. Another was that government set aside funds for survivors' healing. And those funds were later used to establish healing processes within the communities, but also to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a national commission, established, and it functioned for a period of 7 years. And the participants, those who were invited to participate in that Truth and Reconciliation, it was open to all Canadians, but to share their truth, to speak of their experience, where the survivors of the residential schools were invited, the children and staff who ran the residential schools, the children of that staff, and those staff members themselves who still were living, were invited to share. And not only this first generation of survivors who attended, but for those where the first generation of survivors were no longer living, or others who were second generation survivors, but very much impacted by what was done at the residential schools, they were also invited to share their story or to share how that residential school experience impacted them, how the abuses that were held, that happened in some of those schools, the sexual or the physical abuse, but also the cultural abuse, because that too was very destructive. They were invited to share. So it was mainly the Indigenous peoples themselves who shared. And those stories were very, very powerful. There were local, regional, and national events. And at the national events, those who opted to tell their story publicly were able to tell that to gatherings of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people or more. Very powerful experiences. So after 7 years of work and 7 national events, that Truth and Reconciliation Commission wrote 94 calls to action. And they called them calls to action rather than recommendations, because they said you can shelve recommendations, but when you're called to action, you can be judged on whether or not you act. So they called them calls to action, and 14 of those calls were addressed to the churches. And there was church involvement, very forms of church involvement in both the Truth and Reconciliation process and in the post-Truth and Reconciliation time. The Catholic Church in 2016, in response to 2 of those calls, our Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops had 2 documents prepared. One was a document to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, call number 49, and the other was in response to call number 48, and that call was to adopt and to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So the drafters of the 2 documents in the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops' offices, after they had written the documents, they called together a group of people from across the country that they wanted to have the opportunity to read these documents before they were put out, and to give them feedback, and so that they could make changes that they needed to make if people thought that was necessary. And some of the people who were in that group were Indigenous. I was one of those people. And we worked on the document. We made recommendations for change, and they did make some changes. And in 2016, those documents were made public by the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. And for those of us who had come together for a couple of months to work on those documents and give feedback, we realized what a powerful experience it was to gather together and to work toward how do we address reconciliation in Canada? So the group was given the option, if we wanted to stay together, we could. And if we could, why would we stay together? So we processed that over a period of a couple of months. And we did form what we call the Our Lady of Guadalupe Circle. And that circle has representation across the country. It has some official members who are official in that they represent Catholic organizations across the country. And so there are 2 Catholic bishops in that circle, one for the Anglophone bishops, one for the Francophone bishops. There's an Indigenous advisory circle to the bishops, which was established way back in 1994. And that organization, that group of Indigenous peoples, has 2 members in this Our Lady of Guadalupe Circle. The Catholic Women's League, which is a strong Catholic voice in Canada, has a representative. The Knights of Columbus have a representative. And the Canadian Religious Conference has an official representative. And Development and Peace, which is the Canadian arm of Caritas International, Development and Peace has an official representative. And the St. Vincent de Paul Society, a society that addresses poverty in Canada, but has a lot of connection with Indigenous people. A lot of their clientele are Indigenous people. So they too have membership in this gathering. In addition to them, one of the people that was invited into that circle initially was a Jesuit, Father Peter Bisson. And the Jesuits were invited because they themselves began a reconciliation process with the survivors of their schools before the national process was begun. So they already had experience in how do we go about this process. So there has been a Jesuit in the circle. There were representing the religious congregations in the dioceses in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There was a legal group that was structured, and its existence terminated with the settlement agreement, so that group doesn't exist anymore. But 2 of the people who worked on that group, 2 of the women religious who were in that circle previously, they were invited into this circle. So they're present. There are, they have an official advisor who's had a lot of experience with both with the Catholic Conference of Bishops, but with Indigenous people throughout the years. He's there as an advisor. And then there are several at-large members who are Indigenous people. There are 6 or 7 of us, and I'm one of them. And initially, there was a smaller number of Indigenous people, and I was not comfortable with that, so I kept pushing and saying, we need more Indigenous voices at the table. And there were questions around that, and eventually someone said, well, how come you need more Indigenous voices? There are more Indigenous people here than there are from any other organization that's represented. So I heard that and I said, yeah, that's true, but it still didn't sit well with me. And what I realized afterwards, and what I was able to talk about again at a later meeting, was that while there were more Indigenous people present than there were for any one organization, the majority of the circle still remained from a non-Indigenous cultural background. So I just thought it still is really important that there be sufficient Indigenous voices with an Indigenous perspective on what needs to be reconciled and to be able to articulate that. So that change happened, and I'm grateful for that. So there is very much an effort at reconciliation. That circle, the Our Lady of Guadalupe circle, as we worked through why we wanted to stay together, we came up with 4 reasons for wanting to stay together, 4 goals we set them as. And one was that we could be a forum for members, for the members of the circle, because we're all kind of dealing with reconciliation individually in our own context, in our own area, without a broader picture. So to be able to talk about these issues with others in that circle was a very important gift. Another was that we could be a public voice in relation to reconciliation. We are not an official voice of the Catholic Church, but the bishops don't claim that either, because they are each only a voice for their own diocese. So we can be a public voice and speak out our sense of what needs to be reconciled or how we need to reconcile. And then we also saw it important that we as an organization would work to engage Catholics in the calls to action. Because unless we do them, unless we take that action, reconciliation isn't going to happen by itself. And the 4th one was that we would carry out the things we agreed to do. So that's one of the areas of reconciliation in the church. And I think the challenge is the same in the church today in one sense as it was before. Even though the position of the church in relation to inculturation of faith has changed with Vatican II, the challenge remains that people function out of their own culture. And if they don't have an awareness of the other culture, they don't grasp the need for reconciliation. So there's a disconnect. And I'd say the picture right across the country varies. There are dioceses where there are a majority of Indigenous people, and the bishops of those dioceses have been, I think, quite strong, some of them very strong, in articulating the need for reconciliation and in working for reconciliation. There are others that have been not so strong. There are many dioceses in Canada where there are not as many Indigenous people in the diocese as there are people of other cultures. And so the needs of those other cultures seem to take priority. And Indigenous people they're not visible in the church, and they're not in the consciousness of the church. We do struggle with Indigenous people being invisible, except for our failings. So there's one other area of reconciliation that's, for me, is really important, and that is, as I said, after Vatican II, the Church's attitude toward reconciliation with toward inculturation of the faith into Indigenous cultures, the attitude changed. Church began to recognize that God was active in those cultures long before the church ever showed up. And God remains active in those cultures. And so the church began to recognize that there is goodness in these cultures. The Spirit has been bringing about goodness among these peoples. And so we need to find that goodness and build on that. We need to enable those people to take the goodness from within their own culture and bring that face to face with the gospel and allow it to grow and be enlivened and gifted by the gospel. So that shift has changed in the church, but it hasn't necessarily changed in the consciousness of people. But when that shift was happening in the church, the Oblates in Western Canada established an education center for Indigenous people, where they wanted to form a diaconate program for Indigenous peoples, which they did. And their hope was that they would eventually be able to help develop Indigenous priests in that diocese. in that area. The Jesuits did the same here in Canada. They established, in Ontario, they established the Anishinaabe Spiritual Center. And in that center, they developed a diaconate program in collaboration with the Indigenous peoples. And that program has been functioning for the past 49 years. What's really hopeful for me is that the program itself is undergoing a review and a revision and a revitalization at this point. And that there are Jesuits that are involved on that team. There are a couple of people who are Indigenous on the team. And there's one, the director of the center is from Mexico originally, and has been to Chiapas with Michelle, and I've been to Chiapas with Michelle. The other Indigenous person on that team has been to Chiapas to the event that we went to was the 5th anniversary of the death of Samuel Luis in Chiapas, and an acknowledgement of that, and the Pueblo Corriente March. So there's an openness in this team to begin to look at Indigenous theology as well as Indigenous spirituality. For us as Indigenous people, the struggle has long been, people recognize that we have a spirituality, but they don't recognize that we also have our own theology. A theology that's based in our experience of God throughout history. And how do we articulate that? And how do we work with that among our own people? So there's an openness to be able to explore and be able to articulate Indigenous theology here within the center. So that's, for me, that's a sign of reconciliation in Canada as well. And there are others, but I think that's all I'll talk about today. I don't know if Michelle or Joanne had anything more that from our conversation that they wanted to. I think I've covered what I want to cover, though.
Okay, thank you. Well, I know you've already made the interconnection with the Chiapas, kind of this cross-Indigenous solidarity and learnings and support. So actually, this is a good segue for Michelle now to enter the conversation. So we'll continue. So I invite Michelle.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Priscilla.
Thank you.
We've talked a little bit before today on how to plan this session, and really my few remarks will follow on Priscilla's, and precisely starting with the last point about the Indigenous theology and the necessity for theological dialogue with Indigenous peoples, and from our position at theological institutions such as CTU, and where I am today at St. Paul in Canada, which is an old school of theology founded by the Oblates just before the foundation of Canada, and had a long impact on the whole relationship of the church and Indigenous peoples. So it's precisely within this framework of theological dialogue that we the conference we talked about in 2016, and the book was the outcome of that, is only one step of a longer process. And as has been mentioned earlier in the program today, in the meeting, CTU, through its many programs with professors, Claude-Marie Barbour and Professor Eleanor Deutsch, retired now and present with us, and Roger and Yaruko and many others, and I participated for some time, have been taking students as part of their formation for ministry to have a direct connection and contact and listen to the stories of Indigenous peoples on the reservations in South Dakota for 35 years or so. Like, we're talking about more than 1,000 trips over the years. And many students I've taken to Chiapas since I started at CTU in 2000, at least more than a dozen trips for students to enter, engage directly. But there was something specific at this conference we did, which is this theological dialogue. It's a demand. One of the main demands of indigenous peoples to the church is this dialogue, and precisely dialogue for a deeper and better understanding of indigenous worldviews and theology, and to make this part of the thinking. And it's in that direction that the Synod on the Amazon really moved the church, or called the church. So what we did in 2016 is to invite indigenous theologians from these different countries, and to give the primacy to listening to the voice of indigenous theologians, and have the non-indigenous respond to that. This was structured, the conference structured, and the book as well. If you see the 5 sections, in every section, the primacy is for the theological indigenous voice. This is not, of course, the book or the conference was only one step in this longer process. Last January 2020, we were in Chiapas again with Sister Priscilla and few professors from CTU, Professor Doy and Scott Alexander and myself, and Elia Cardenas, CTU graduate and now candidate in the DMIN program, and has been there with members of her parish, has participated as a student. So there's this ongoing connection to continue this dialogue, and precisely with theologians, and around the question of the role of and importance of indigenous theology in the church. So in the dialogue that we're doing, and the dialogue connected to reconciliation, but it's also connected to an important dimension, which is a major demand of indigenous people, which is decolonization. And this touches on the question of land, of self-determination, on the question of culture, but also on the question of spirituality and theology. And this is precisely where our role comes in. I don't think with all the dialogue with indigenous theologians from Canada to Chile, there is always still, they are not heard in the church. It's not just, you just hear, but not actually act, or there is still no room in the theological spaces in our schools for the indigenous theological voices and the importance. And as Sister Priscilla said, the challenge today is the same as it was 40 or 50. So there are good intentions, there is goodwill, there is commitment, yet a big question, why is this not happening? Why is the dialogue or the actual participation for example, we're talking about decolonization in relation to land and self-determination, but there is also a decolonization in the church that has to happen in relation to the presence of indigenous voices, where their voice is not, where the attitude towards indigenous people is not just as objects of pastoral concern or pastoral work, as has been for evangelization. So yes, we are stuck, and that attempt in a Catholic context to bring indigenous theologians, listen to their perspective on ecclesiology, on mission, on spirituality, on relation to theology and the land. They're all vital and relevant questions for today's church. I mean, they are more relevant today than before, and this is precisely what Laudato Si and what I consider as part 2 of Laudato Si, which is Querida Amazonia, the follow-up. This is like going to a very concrete context, church context, and to give voice to the local church and the indigenous people. So this is, in a way, what we're doing today is a continuation of this dialogue. We're trying to promote in the way we as schools publish books, bring people. That's what we do as theologians. We do 2 things. One is education, and we've been doing these courses for a long time. And 2 is the question of research and theological investigation. and writing and publication for the promotion of this dialogue. So that's an important emphasis, and this is ongoing. And what has been happening in the sequence of this series is we do have now a network of indigenous and non-indigenous theologians who have been opened and committed to this process from Bolivia and Chile to Canada, that we are in touch. We are continuing the conversation. We met at CTU, we met before, we met after in Chiapas. We will be meeting in the future in Canada as soon as the COVID restrictions are lifted. And what's really important in terms of a theological move on my part, that is a continuation of the work we started at CTU, is at St. Paul we'll be inviting, as soon as I said, the COVID restrictions are lifted, a conversation with Indigenous Catholic elders, a group of them. Sister Priscilla is one of them, and there are many others across the country, to meet with the Faculty of Theology. And we want to ask them the question, what do you expect of a Faculty of Theology today that has made a commitment? Because Sister Priscilla mentioned a chapter in the book on the Church and Indigenous People by Brian McDonough from Montreal, who worked for the Catholic bishops for a long time. And this is a very succinct chapter that summarizes the work of the Church and the attitude. But it's there on page 69. There are 8 points. After the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to action, the Canadian Church, on the voice of several bishops, made the 8-point commitment. They are clearly listed in the book. And one of them is to call upon theological centers to support Indigenous reflection within the Catholic community. They pertain mostly to all Catholic institutions, parishes, dioceses, universities, but also, so this again is not happening, hasn't happened. We're 5 years now after the truth, the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation and the calls to action, and this is not happening. So we need more action, and that's one of the reasons for doing more publications and more meetings, is to keep the fire going, you know, to it's very easy in such a time of crisis as we are all experiencing with COVID-19 to lose the momentum on many important issues, and that could be one of them that could fall off the attention of people and the churches. So yes, and we're connecting from the theological perspective, the dialogue for reconciliation and with the indigenous movements around decolonization. And I'm pretty sure that our work, we have a very well-established core faculty at CTU that have been doing this work, and we're carrying on. And now we are connected as a network of Catholic schools in different parts of the Americas to continue with this work. So this would be my contribution to this conversation and how I see the future of this dialogue in the theological field, which is our main area of responsibility. Thank you.
Okay. So I was waiting for your photos.
Oh.
Did you want to show them, or?
Yes, sorry. I will show like 2-3 photos, just.
Because it has to do with the Encuentro Teológico that you mentioned in January. So yeah.
Right. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
I will use a full. So we go to these meetings in San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas and to these marches in January. And why do we go to San Cristobal? Because it's a diocese that has taken the indigenous cause very seriously. And here in this photo, excuse me, let me stop sharing for just 1 second. Go to my computer. In this one march, you can see Sister Priscilla and myself and Sister Eva and other people. That's the time of the delegation from Canada. We go to San Cristobal because it's a diocese that has been acting for a long time. So it has become like a theological and ecclesial school where we go to learn, to participate, to learn, to think, to come together, to organize. And we've been several years, I've been for more than 30 times now to these January meetings. This is a photo from the conference we did last January with the local bishop and theologians from different parts at a center that's dedicated to continue the work and legacy of Bishop Samuel Ruiz, who was the Bishop of San Cristobal for 40 years, from 1960 to 2000. At the conference that CTU was a partner, many of us spoke and shared our stories and reflections. And at the same time, we shared with them the copy of the book that was dedicated to the movement in Chiapas. This is an example of some of the groups that classrooms we take, and this is from a few years ago. And here you see some faces you might recognize from CTU. In these groups, we go to indigenous communities, participate in liturgies, learn about the history. This is at Actial, where there was a major massacre in '97. People died for their witness to faith and peace and justice. We visit parishes, participate in their liturgies, and learn from them. Pope Francis went to Chiapas in 2016, in February 2016, because Chiapas has been misunderstood by the church authorities and was under attack for a while. So Francis wanted to fix that. So went there in 2016, and as you see in this picture, close up on that section, he went to visit the tomb of Bishop Ruiz in the cathedral. And, they said a prayer there. And because for a long time, there was a misunderstanding of what does it really mean to have an indigenous church or a church with an indigenous faith. And it was a new experiment. But after 2016, and with all the preparation for the Synod for Amazonia, all this basically is settled, because what Amazonia did is what Chiapas has been doing for 40 years. And thus, this is the reason why we actually go there. It has become a theological school as well as an ecclesial school. And many of our students at CTU profited from this over a long period, and we will continue to do that. Thanks for the reminder, Yaruko.
Great, thank you.